The year was 1871, and the wind across the Texas panhandle had a voice of its own, a mournful song that swept over the endless grasses and bit at any exposed skin. Nathaniel Prescott, all of 19 years though he felt older, pulled his worn hat lower, the brim doing little to shield his eyes from the relentless sun. He rode slightly apart from the main body of the cattle drive, scouting ahead as was his usual task. Loneliness was a familiar companion, almost a part of the landscape itself, vast and indifferent. His parents were gone, lost to fever years back, and his only brother had headed west, chasing gold and stories, vanishing into the haze of the frontier like smoke. All Nate had was his horse, his saddle, and the meager pay that kept him moving from one dusty trail to another. His life was a routine of hard work, scant comfort, and an unspoken ache for something more, something he couldn't quite name. It was a stasis born of necessity, a quiet desperation held in check by the daily demands of survival. He'd been with this outfit for 6 months, pushing a reluctant herd north towards the promise of Kansas railheads. The other hands were a rough bunch, their talk coarse, their tempers quick. Nate kept mostly to himself, his silence often mistaken for aloofness, though it was more a shield against the casual cruelties of men who had little else to offer. He found a strange solace in the open land, in the predictability of the stars at night, even in the omnipresent threat of storm or stampede. It was a hard existence, stripped bare of softness, yet it was the only one he knew. The land itself felt like an extension of his inner state, wide, often empty, beautiful in a stark and unforgiving way. He carried his memories like stones in his pockets, the weight of them a constant, familiar pressure. The air grew heavy that afternoon, the sky taking on a bruised, yellowish hue that promised trouble. The cattle became restless, lowing uneasily. Experienced drovers muttered about hail or worse. Nate had been tracking a small group of strays that had wandered into a series of broken arroyos, his attention fixed on the task. The storm, when it broke, was sudden and violent. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the dry earth to slick mud. Thunder cracked like artillery, and lightning split the sky, making his horse dusty, shy, and rear. In the chaos, he lost sight of the main herd, the strays scattered, and soon he was utterly disoriented, the familiar landmarks swallowed by the tempest. When the storm finally passed hours later, leaving behind a battered, sodden world, Nate found himself alone, truly alone. The landscape was altered, the ground scoured. He had no clear idea which direction the herd had gone, or even where he was in relation to any known trail. He spent the rest of that day and the next searching, his calls swallowed by the immensity of the plains. His provisions were meager, the sun beat down, turning the wet ground into a steaming oven. Despair, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of his resolve. It was on the third morning, as he crested a low rise, weak from hunger and exposure, that his world tilted irrevocably. They seemed to materialize from the land itself, a dozen Kiowa warriors, their painted faces grim, their movements fluid and silent as shadows. Nate's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He had no time to reach for the rifle in its scabbard, no time even to wheel Dusty around. They were on him in an instant, a whirlwind of motion and harsh cries. He was dragged from his horse, his hat knocked away, the sun blinding him. Rough hands bound his wrists, the rawhide biting into his skin. He saw the glint of a knife, the dark, unreadable eyes fixed on him, and a cold certainty washed over him. This was where his trail ended. He expected a swift death, a brutal end to his fear. Instead, he was pulled along, a captive, stumbling behind one of an unyielding warrior's pony. His horse, Dusty, was led away by another. The Kiowa spoke in guttural bursts, their language incomprehensible, their expressions a mixture of contempt and grim satisfaction. Nate, numb with shock and terror, could only register fragments: the sweat-slicked hide of the pony in front of him, the burning of the sun on his unprotected head, the jolting pain in his bound wrists. He thought of his mother's gentle face, his brother's easy laugh, images that twisted in his gut like a knife. He was a piece of property now, less than human in their eyes, a symbol of the encroaching world they fought so fiercely to resist. After what felt like an eternity of rough travel, they reached a temporary camp, a collection of hide lodges nestled in a shallow, cottonwood-lined ravine. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and something else, something wild and unfamiliar. He was shoved to the ground near a smoldering fire, his ankles bound as well. Children, drawn by the commotion, stared at him with wide, curious eyes, their initial boldness quickly replaced by shy retreat when a warrior barked at them. Women paused in their work, their faces impassive, their gazes lingering on him before turning away. He was an object of scrutiny, a dangerous curiosity. A tall, imposing man emerged from the largest lodge, his presence radiating an undeniable authority. His hair was streaked with gray, his face a mask of stern dignity. This, Nate surmised, was the chief, Towhausen. The warriors who had captured him spoke to the chief, their gestures animated, pointing towards Nate. Towhausen listened, his dark eyes fixed on the captive, betraying nothing of his thoughts. Nate's throat was dry, his body trembling despite the heat. He tried to meet the chief's gaze, to project something, anything other than raw fear, but his courage failed him. He lowered his eyes, waiting for judgment. It was then that he first saw her. She stood slightly behind the chief, partially obscured by the lodge entrance. A young woman, perhaps a year or two younger than himself. Her black hair was neatly braided, adorned with a few simple beads that caught the light. She wore a soft doeskin dress, modestly decorated. Unlike the others whose faces were hard or indifferent, her expression was one of quiet observation, her dark eyes holding a flicker of something he couldn't decipher. Not hatred, not fear, but a deep, unsettling attentiveness. This was Maysa, Towhausen's daughter. She did not speak, did not move closer, but Nate felt her gaze on him, a steady pressure amidst the turmoil of his capture. The initial hours blurred into a nightmarish haze. He was left tied, exposed to the elements and the casual disdain of the camp. Warriors would occasionally prod him with a moccasined foot or utter harsh words he didn't understand, their faces contorted with old anger. One warrior in particular, younger and more overtly aggressive, whom Nate would later learn was named Honyahaka, seemed to take a particular interest in tormenting him, circling him like a predator. His eyes glittering with malice. Nate closed his eyes, trying to retreat into himself, to find some small, untouched core of resilience, but fear was a relentless tide. As darkness fell, the campfires blazed, casting dancing shadows on the lodge skins. The sounds of the Kiowa evening, soft conversations, the cry of a baby, the distant howl of a coyote, were alien and threatening to his ears. He was given no food, no water. Thirst became a torment, his tongue thick, his lips cracked. He drifted in and out of a restless, fearful doze, each awakening a fresh confirmation of his desperate plight. He was a long way from any hope of rescue, a forgotten speck in an immense and hostile land. Sometime deep in the night, when the camp was quiet and most fires had burned down to embers, he became aware of a presence. He tensed, expecting another tormentor. But the movement was stealthy, hesitant. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness near one of the lodges. It was Maysa. She moved with a grace that was almost invisible, her feet making no sound on the packed earth. She carried a small gourd. She knelt beside him, her face unreadable in the dim light. Nate's heart pounded. Was this some new form of cruelty? She glanced around quickly, ensuring they were unobserved, then held the gourd to his lips. Water, cool, blessed water. He drank greedily, the simple act an almost unbearable relief. When he had finished, she produced a small piece of dried meat from a fold in her dress and pressed it into his hand. Her fingers brushed his, a fleeting, unintentional contact that sent a strange shiver through him. She said nothing, her eyes conveying a warning, an urgency. Then, as silently as she had come, she was gone, melting back into the shadows. Nate stared at the spot where she had been, the taste of water still on his parched tongue, the small piece of meat clutched in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was life. It was a thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. Why? Why would she risk helping him, an enemy, a white man? He had no answers, only a profound, bewildered gratitude. He ate the meat slowly, a new kind of watchfulness settling over him. He was still a captive, still in mortal danger, but something had shifted, a single small act of kindness in the heart of hostility. It was a fragile seed, but it had been planted. The days that followed settled into a grim routine. Nate remained tied near the central area of the camp, a constant, visible reminder of the outside world's threat. Warriors came and went, some ignoring him, others, like Honyahaka, continuing their casual intimidation. Honyahaka, with his sharp features and restless energy, seemed to embody all the animosity Nate had expected. He would stand before Nate, speaking rapidly in Kiowa, his tone laced with contempt, sometimes gesturing with a knife in a way that made Nate's blood run cold. Nate learned to keep his gaze downcast, to make himself as small and unthreatening as possible. Tohausen, the chief, observed him often, his expression unchanging. Nate wondered what discussions were taking place, what fate was being decided for him. Was he to be traded, killed in some ritual, or simply left to waste away? The uncertainty was a torment in itself. He learned to read the camp's rhythms, the women's work, the children's play, the warriors' preparations for hunts or patrols. He was an outsider, a ghost at their feast, yet he was undeniably present, a problem they had to solve. Maysa continued her secret ministrations. It was never much. A sip of water when no one was looking, a piece of leftover bread or cooked root slipped to him under the cover of dusk or pre-dawn gloom. Sometimes she would simply pass by, and her eyes would meet his for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement that was both terrifying and sustaining. He began to anticipate these moments, these small, furtive acts of mercy. He saw the risk she took. If she were discovered, the consequences for her would be severe. Her tribe valued loyalty and solidarity above almost all else. Aiding an enemy, even in such small ways, would be seen as a betrayal. He tried to convey his gratitude through his own eyes, a look of thanks, a plea for continued help. There were no words they could share. The gulf of language and culture was immense, yet in those silent exchanges, something elemental passed between them, a recognition of shared humanity, perhaps. He saw in her face not the hardened features of a warrior, but a softness, a compassion that seemed out of place in this harsh environment and among her seemingly implacable people. He wondered about her life, her thoughts, her reasons. Was it pity, or something else? He knew only that her quiet courage was keeping him alive. One afternoon, Honyahaka, bolder than usual, perhaps fueled by some drink or a successful hunt, approached Nate with a length of rope. He began to pantomime a hanging, a cruel grin stretching his lips, his eyes gleaming. Nate's stomach clenched with icy fear. He could feel the eyes of the camp on them. This time, it felt different, more purposeful. Just as Honyahaka reached for Nate's neck, Tohausen's voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. Honyahaka froze, then slowly turned, his arrogance deflating slightly. The chief spoke briefly, his tone stern. Honyahaka scowled but backed away, casting a look of pure hatred at Nate before stalking off. Nate let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The chief had intervened. But why? Was it a reprieve, or merely a postponement of the inevitable? Later that day, Maysa came with his usual meager portion of food. Her face was troubled, her eyes shadowed with a new anxiety. She pressed the food into his hand, her fingers lingering for a moment longer than usual, a silent pressure that communicated her disquiet. He understood. The delicate balance that kept him alive was becoming more precarious. Honyahaka's open display of aggression was a sign that patience within the camp was wearing thin. He started to notice other things. The way Maysa would sometimes pause in her chores, her gaze drifting towards the horizon as if looking for something, or perhaps yearning for something. He saw the respect with which the other women treated her, but also a certain distance, as if her status as the chief's daughter set her apart. He wondered if she too felt a kind of isolation within her own community. He saw her tenderness with the children, the way a small child, a girl with bright, curious eyes, would often follow her, chattering away. In those moments, Maysa's face would soften, a gentle smile touching her lips, and Nate would see a glimpse of the person beneath the stoic exterior demanded by her world. He tried to learn a few Kiowa words, picking them up from the snippets of conversation he overheard. The commands shouted at him. Ha for yes, ka for no. Pa-ta for water, he thought. When Maysa brought it, he would try to say, ah-ho, thank you, a word he'd heard used in contexts of gratitude. When he first managed to utter it, his voice raspy, Maysa froze for a split second. her eyes widening almost imperceptibly before she quickly masked her reaction and moved away. But he knew she had heard and understood. It was a tiny bridge, a fragile connection built across a chasm of silence and fear. The summer days stretched long and hot. Nate's physical condition deteriorated despite Maysa's help. The small amounts of food were not enough to sustain him properly. He grew thinner, weaker. The sun beat down mercilessly. Sometimes a different woman, older and stern-faced, would bring him a bowl of thin broth, seemingly on the chief's orders. It was barely enough. His hope, which had flickered with Maysa's first act of kindness, began to dim again, replaced by a dull resignation. He dreamt of cool streams, of his mother's cooking, of freedom. He dreamt of escape, but in his waking hours, the heavily guarded camp, his own weakness, and the vast unknown territory beyond made such thoughts seem like pure fantasy. One evening, a council seemed to be taking place in Tohausen's lodge. Voices were raised, angrier than usual. Nate could hear Honyahaka's sharp, insistent tones and Tohausen's deeper, more measured responses, though occasionally the chief's voice also rose in what sounded like frustration or command. Nate lay on the hard ground, his heart heavy. He sensed his fate was being debated. He looked for Maysa, but she was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she was inside the lodge with her father. The thought brought him little comfort. What influence could she possibly have against men like Honyahaka, men whose hearts seemed filled with a thirst for vengeance against all white intruders? Later, long after the angry voices had subsided and an uneasy quiet had fallen over the camp, Maysa appeared. She moved more quickly than usual, her customary caution seemingly overridden by a new urgency. She carried a small bundle. When she reached him, she didn't just give him food. She knelt, and with swift, practiced movements, began to work on the rawhide bindings at his ankles with a small, sharp piece of flint she produced from the bundle. Nate stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. Was this a trick? Was he being set up for some crueler game? But her face was earnest, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. She looked up at him, met his gaze directly, and put a finger to her lips, then pointed towards the darkness beyond the camp, in the direction opposite the main entrance and the most vigilant sentries. Escape. She was offering him escape. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Hope, so long suppressed, surged through him, so potent it was almost painful. But with it came a wave of fear, not just for himself, but for her. If she were caught. She finished with his ankles and moved to his wrists. The bindings were tight, chafing his raw skin, but her touch was surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient. He could feel the slight tremor in her hands. She was as frightened as he was. When his hands were free, she pressed the bundle into them, a water skin, a few strips of dried meat, the piece of flint she had used. It was a pitifully small store of supplies for a journey into hostile territory, but it was more than he could have dared to hope for. She whispered a single word, one he hadn't heard before, but her gesture made its meaning clear. Go. She pointed again, more insistently this time, towards the darkest part of the ravine's edge, where the shadows of the cottonwoods were deepest. He hesitated. To leave her to face the consequences of her actions felt like a betrayal of the incredible gift she was giving him. He tried to convey his conflict, his gratitude, his fear for her, all with his eyes, his expression. He reached out, his newly freed hand instinctively wanting to touch her arm, to offer some comfort or thanks, but she flinched back almost imperceptibly, her eyes darting around. The danger was too great. She gave him a small, desperate push. Go now, she urged, this time in a fierce whisper that brooked no argument. He understood. Every second he delayed put her in greater peril. He nodded, a lump in his throat too large for words, even if he had known which ones to use. He clutched the bundle to his chest. He took one last look at her face, trying to memorize every feature in the dim light, the high cheekbones, the steady gaze that had held such compassion, the bravery that humbled him. Then he turned and moved, as silently as he could, towards the shadow she had indicated. Each step was an agony of caution. The ground was uneven, littered with unseen obstacles. His legs were weak from disuse and malnutrition. He could hear the blood pounding in his ears, convinced that every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, would bring the entire camp down upon them. He dared not look back, though the urge to do so, to see if Maysa was safe, was almost overwhelming. He reached the edge of the cottonwoods, the darkness deeper here, offering some concealment. He paused for a moment, listening. The camp behind him was quiet, save for the occasional cough or the sigh of a sleeping dog. He imagined Maysa slipping back to her lodge, her heart racing, praying her actions had gone unnoticed. The weight of her sacrifice pressed down on him. She had risked everything, her standing in the tribe, perhaps her very life, for him, a stranger, an enemy. With renewed determination, fueled by her courage, Nate pushed himself onward. He moved slowly at first, his body stiff and awkward, but gradually, as the distance between him and the Kiowa camp grew, a desperate strength flowed into his limbs. He followed the ravine for as long as he could, using its cover, then struck out across the open prairie, guided by the stars, heading in what he hoped was a southerly direction, back towards the lands where he might find his own people, or at least a familiar landmark. The journey was a blur of exhaustion, fear, and gnawing hunger. The small amount of food Maysa had given him was gone too quickly. The water skin, refilled at a muddy seep, was his most precious possession. He traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in any cover he could find, a shallow depression, a thicket of brush, a stand of tall grass. He saw signs of native hunting parties several times, smoke in the distance, fresh pony tracks, and each time, his heart leaped into his throat, forcing him to backtrack or make wide detours. The land was beautiful, but it was an enemy, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a warning. He thought constantly of Maysa. Her face was imprinted on his mind. He replayed her acts of kindness, her quiet defiance, her final, desperate urgency. He wondered what had happened after he left. Had her father, Tohausen, discovered her deed? What was her punishment? The thought that she might be suffering because of him was a fresh torment. He prayed for her safety, a strange new kind of prayer for someone he barely knew, yet to whom he owed his life. He grew weaker, his feet were blistered and bleeding. Delirium began to nip at the edges of his consciousness. He saw mirages, heard voices that weren't there. He stumbled on, driven by a primal instinct to survive, and by the memory of Maysa's courage. He could not let her sacrifice be in vain. He had to make it. After what he guessed was nearly a week, though time had lost all meaning, when he was at the very end of his endurance, subsisting on insects and a few bitter roots, he saw it, a faint dust cloud in the distance. At first, he feared it was another Kiowa party. He tried to hide, but he was too weak to move quickly. As the dust cloud drew nearer, he could make out riders, their forms indistinct in the heat haze. Then, a glint of metal, the shape of cowboy hats. Relief, so profound it was dizzying, washed over him. He tried to stand, to wave, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the parched earth. The riders saw him. They approached cautiously at first, then, recognizing his desperate state, galloped forward. He heard voices, English voices, rough but familiar. Hands lifted him, offered him water from a canteen. He looked up into the concerned, weathered faces of men from a different cattle outfit, strangers, but his people. He tried to speak, to explain, but only a dry croak emerged. He was safe, or at least, he was no longer a captive. He had survived. Nathaniel Prescott's recovery was slow. He was taken to a small settlement, little more than a collection of rough-hewn buildings, where a woman with kind eyes and calloused hands tended to his wounds and nursed him back from the brink. He learned that the cattle drive he'd been with had assumed him lost in the storm, or perhaps killed by it, and had moved on. He was alone again, but this time, the loneliness felt different. It was overlaid with the fresh, raw memory of his ordeal and the indelible image of Maysa. He rarely spoke of his time with the Kiowa. When questioned, he offered only sparse details of his capture and escape, omitting Maysa's role entirely. How could he explain it to men whose views of Native Americans were shaped by fear, by conflict, by stories of brutality they would not understand? They might even condemn her, or worse, see her actions as a sign of weakness, a reason to further despise her people. Her secret was safe with him, a sacred trust. But he could not forget. The experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The world no longer seemed so black and white. The Kiowa were not just faceless savages, They were people, complex, driven by their own histories, their own codes. And among them, there had been one young woman whose compassion had transcended the hatred and violence that surrounded them. He eventually found work on a small ranch, his body slowly regaining its strength, though the haunted look in his eyes remained. He was quieter now, more introspective. The vast plains, once a symbol of his solitary existence, now held a different meaning. They were a place of immense danger, yes, but also a place where he had witnessed an extraordinary act of courage and kindness. The wind, which had once sung a mournful song of loneliness, now seemed to whisper Maysa's name, a reminder of the life he owed her. He often found himself gazing towards the north, towards the lands where the Kiowa roamed. He would never see her again, he knew that. Their paths had crossed for a brief, desperate moment, two souls from warring worlds connected by a thread of shared humanity, and then diverged forever. Yet her image remained vivid in his mind, her quiet strength, her defiant compassion, the incredible risk she had taken for a stranger. He never learned what became of Maysa, or if her father, Tohausen, ever discovered her role in his escape. He could only hope that she had found peace, that her own life had not been unduly burdened by her act of mercy. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, watching the sun set in a blaze of color over the western horizon, he would touch the small, smooth piece of flint she had given him, which he kept hidden in his possibles bag. It was a tangible link to a past that felt both like a nightmare and a strange, poignant dream. Nathaniel Prescott lived a long life on the frontier, witnessing its slow transformation. He saw more conflict, more sorrow, but he also saw moments of understanding, of connection in unexpected places. He carried within him the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, in the heart of hatred and fear, a single act of kindness could illuminate the soul, a small flame of hope that could make all the difference. He never forgot the Kiowa chief's daughter, the young woman who had secretly kept him alive, who had shown him that resilience and compassion could blossom even in the most barren and hostile ground. Her memory became a quiet touchstone, a reminder of the profound and often unseen courage that existed in the human heart, a courage that asked for nothing in return, yet gave everything. He understood then that home was not just a place, but a connection, a moment of grace that could redefine a life, and in that understanding, he found a measure of his own, hard-won peace.